Well, it's another Monday, and I wound up getting on here a little bit later today than I meant to, but I wanted to share a little something. This one here is not electrical or drivability like a lot of them. It's a little different, and this vehicle here was a meat grinder with a capital M. Took us a while to get it worked out, and it had more than one problem, but I'm just going to jump in here and see if I can share this with you as quick as I can. Although not like I'm in a hurry, but there's no use in mincing words. Have you ever taken a course where somebody didn't have enough material and were supposed to fill up a particular amount of time and talked very slowly, and it made you wonder why you even went to the class? I've been in a few of those, and it just drives me up the wall. I'm a cut to the chase kind of instructor, and some people say I go too fast, but at least on a YouTube video you can rewind and replay if you want to. This one here was a Oldsmobile Alero that belonged to some people that I knew that were really nice people, and it had a rattling noise in the engine. Well, this sounds, what are you going to do with that? Well, when you're listening to any kind of a noise that's going on in the engine, what you're going to have to do is determine as near as you can where the noise is coming from and what's causing it. That's just a no-brainer, Now, if it's an engine knock or if it's main bearings rattling or something like that, you're going to have to go pretty deep. Well, this one here, they'd owned the car since it was new, and at about 120,000 miles, they started noticing this rattling noise. It wasn't vehicle speed related, and it wasn't always there. But you could rev the engine when it was doing it and let the engine come back down, and I'm talking about in neutral. And you would hear a rattle. It would be a brrr, just a little something, I said, what in the world is that racket? That's just strange. And so basically they went to the GM dealer, and the dealer replaced the catalytic converter because in their mind it sounded like the brick was bouncing around in the catalytic converter. Because I usually like to take a rubber hammer and bump the catalyst and see if it's making a noise, I don't know what they did. Car seemed fine for a week or two, but then the sound came back. So another trip to the dealer. Nobody at the dealership was rude, but they just showed them the door. That's what the owners told me. I didn't talk to anybody at the dealer, and I like this dealer, and I like the guy that owns it. I just don't know what happened there. But the Alero wound up at our door rattling. Actually, the lady that drove it or that owned it was one of the people that worked at on our college campus. But anyway, now knocks are a peculiar thing anyway. Some of you might recognize this as a Volkswagen Bug, an old Volkswagen Bug crankshaft. There's the rods. You see these little bumps on these rods here, these little things? That, whenever you put that crankshaft out there and you raise those rods up so that these little shapes on the rods, I don't know what you're going to call those things, little sometimes I can't come up with a word that I like to use, but anyway, this particular thing tells you that what's the top of the rod, so you don't get confused about what's what. You put it in the vise and you raise it up, which one's, which cylinder and all that. But anyway, back in '79, I helped a roommate of mine rebuild the VW engine on his rail buggy. He had a rail buggy that was built out of an old Bug, and my dad had a VW shop, but he did most of the engine building even when I was working there. I had built domestic engines, but I hadn't built all that many Bug engines, and it had been a long time since I had built one. And so on domestic engines, the front of the piston, where the arrow is or the notch or the F on the piston or whatever, goes toward the front of the engine where the belts are. That's how I built this rail buggy. The front of the VW Bug piston arrow on top. On the Bug, though, goes toward the flywheel, which is the front of the car. So the arrows on these pistons go toward the front of the car, and which is also the front of the engine. But the flywheel end is the front on a Volkswagen Bug and on a Corvair. But on this Volkswagen Bug, forget about the other engines, that arrow is supposed to be pointing toward the flywheel, not toward the part of the engine where the belts are, which I had built too many domestic engines by that time to remember that. And this thing, I had put the pistons in backwards. Now the crazy thing about this thing, when we first fired it up, that wrench pin is offset just a little bit. When we first fired this thing up, it wasn't knocking. But the longer it ran, the warmer it got, the more it knocked. And it would run like a strapped ape. I ain't kidding you. This thing, whenever you went to take off on it, if you popped the clutch in first gear, it would literally and it had been shortened. You know, the 14 inches behind the seats had been removed. This thing would literally pull the front wheels off the ground about 3 feet whenever you were taking off, and it would just absolutely scream. So I called my dad, you know, because I was down in Texas and his Volkswagen shop was up here, and I told him what was going on, and he said, "You put the pistons in backwards." He said, "Which way did you point those arrows?" And I told him, and I went, "Oh man, I knew that. I'd forgotten about it." Well, I took it all apart and put it back together the right way, and the knocking was gone, but the power was gone too. Now it had normal power, but it didn't have this astonishingly high-powered, incredible jerk the wheels off the ground. I mean, it would never do that when the engine was built the right way. And my dad had told me, you know, if you're just going to race somebody that's got a normal bug engine and you want to outrun them at one time, if you build it wrong like that, it'll run off and leave them. But anyway, well, on this Alero again, back mildly revving the engine up and allowing it to return to idle would usually produce a rattling noise. As the engine was slowing down, it sounded like it was occurring at about twice the speed of the crankshaft. Now the odd thing was I couldn't hear the noise anywhere with a stethoscope probe. Noisy as all get out in the oil pan area. If I screwed the end off the stethoscope and used it as a listening pipe, I could hold that thing around listening for it. Sometimes you can hear stuff like that that you can't hear with a contact probe. And when I was holding that probe up to the bottom of the oil pan, it was really noisy there. But if you touched the oil pan with the contact probe screwed on the end of it, you wouldn't hear anything. So basically the noise was there. It was coming, it was louder right underneath the oil pan than it was anywhere else. And that really kind of tripped me out. I was trying to figure out what in the world was going on there. Well, there's two chains in this one. The timing chain, pulling the water pump, is here. You know, and there's your cam and the crank, water pump, camshafts. And then on the bottom down there, which is not visible here, is the oil pump, the chain that pulls the oil pump and the balancer assembly. And there's a little tensioner that goes with that. It's a balance shaft chain. And this thing was sounding more and more to me like a chain. Now, I want to say something about this. That water pump, one of the things I discovered working on some of these 2.4 liter engines was back in the day when those things first came out in the real early 90s, they had that water pump fixed so you could change the water pump without pulling the cover and pulling the timing chain off, which was a beautiful design. You could go down in there and you could unbolt that water pump, and it had a spline shaft that went up in that gear that was riding in that bearing. You could just pull the water pump out, put another water pump back on it, buckle it all up, and you've never even disturbed the timing chain. For some odd reason, I don't know why, somebody probably does that may even be able to type us an answer to this. At some point, GM decided they wanted the water pump and the gear that was driving it to be all one piece, so you would have to rip the engine, you know, the timing chain off to get the stupid water pump changed out. That's just neither here nor there, but I just wanted to share that while I was going. Well, the noise sounded more like a chain than anything else. Well, I wasn't all that familiar with this motor, so I called my friend Randy at this big Chevy dealer that was close by, and he said they were replacing these balance shafts for a noise like that. They include the oil pump and can be rebuilt, but the customer wanted a new one. So, you know, when I shared the thing with it, all right, so about $400, the balancer purchase wasn't to be taken lightly. I didn't want to just throw one on there because they wanted a new one. I wanted to do a little more checking. So we pulled the timing cover, started it up, watched the timing chain. I like to do that. I've got a video on my YouTube channel where I was checking a Dodge 3.7, I think it was, where we had put a, you know, pulled the heads off and we put it back together. One of the timing chains was really noisy, and that was a different story there. But you could see what was going on there. And I like to watch it with my eyes and see what's going on if I can. The chain was nice and tight while we were watching it, but the noise wasn't there either, so that was inconclusive. No visible signature marks where the chain might have been flopping around hitting anything. So with the customer's blessing, we went after the balancer. Now this is the balancer off of that car laying on the table. The pan has to come off, which is no small feat because that water pipe's running up under it. You got to pull all that mess out, drain the cooling system, and everything like that. Balancer shaft has to be timed with a special tool. That's a special tool right there. It's funny to me how that J41088 tool is drawn backwards. It's actually supposed to be put on there with this little ear going the other way, but I guess it'll work either way. And that's what it looked like when we put it on there. See how that hole lines up with that little ear that they show right here pointing the other way? And so, but anyway, there's the how you line that up. That's on the opposite end from the gear and stuff, but that's how you time it. All right. So the GM shop manual calls for a 40 thousandths of an inch brass feeler gauge to be inserted between the chain tensioner and the chain. A steel feeler gauge, you got to put it right in there, and you got to dial it in, you know, with the right amount of torque, with 3 pounds of pressure applied to the tensioner before you torque the bolt, which has just got to be absolutely perfect. It sounded very critical to me. Now the problem I had was, I looked high and low, called Snap-on, looked for shim stock, looked everywhere I could find. There was no 40 thousandths of an inch brass feeler gauge available. I could come up with a 35, but I couldn't come up with a 40. And I was thinking, well, if it's that doggone critical, and if it needs that kind of spacing, and a feeler gauge that's limber enough to bend instead of being like a steel one, you know, a steel 40 thousandths one, we'd have trouble bending that one, but the brass one, I guess, would be more pliable, is what they had the idea. Anyway, there was no brass 40 thousandths feeler gauge I could find anywhere. Snap-on didn't even have one. But we cut a piece of plastic from a hand cleaner jug and measured it. It was 40 thousandths of an inch thick. And so we put that in there and used that. Now 3 months, good. It was really good for 3 months. They had no noise out of this thing for 3 solid months after we got it all put back together. Then it comes back with the engine reassembled, the noise was gone, right? So it came back for 3 months with what sounded like almost exactly the same noise. And I thought, man, I thought we had this thing worked out. Have you ever seen that? One time I was talking to my shop foreman when I was at the Ford place about a Crown Victoria that was beating us up. I don't remember what was wrong with it. But we worked on that thing. Finally figured out what was going on with it. We thought, you know, it's one of them things where you feel like you got it, but you're not really sure. And so the shop foreman he's a funny guy to me. He's, you know, looked kind of like Slim Pickens, only he was not quite as tall, talked just like him too. And so he was standing over one day scratching his head, and I says, I guess we must have that Crown Victoria fixed. I hadn't seen it in about 3 weeks. And he says, shut your mouth. He said, if you mention that thing, it'll be in the write-up area this afternoon, and we'll have to start working on it again. He was that superstitious about it. Just don't talk about it, and it won't be back out there. We didn't ever see it again, but I thought that was funny. All right, the car came back to what almost sounded like the same noise. We replaced the balance shaft chain and gear. Now that was nasty because we had to pull the motor out, pull the crankshaft out, had to heat that thing like a flywheel ring gear to get it off there and on there. And I mean, it was just a bear. And it was still noisy. The timing chain was rattling, so we turned it around because GM said if you took the timing chain off and put it back on, but it was turned around the other way, it might make it rattle. So, you know, you're just, by this time, you're just wanting to tear your hair out. I say, what am I doing wrong on this thing, you know? And so the tensioner has to be cocked before it's installed. You know how that works. You know, you got to pull that thing in. See manual to reset, see a little word on there. All right, so what we noticed about the tensioner, though, was that this one was sticking at about the halfway point. We couldn't take a chance on it since this silly engine was prone to make noises, so we replaced it, and we didn't hear the original noise after that. There's the new tensioners pushing on there, and what we noticed about the tensioner was the one sticking halfway right, so we put that one on there. All right, so the Alero came back one more time 6 months later with a totally different noise, and on that trip the flywheel was cracked, believe it or not, and we had to replace that. It was a different noise. When I got under there listening to it, you know, it had different dynamics to it and everything. I got under there listening to it, and it was really, really loud coming out of the bell housing area. And so I knew at that point that we needed to pull the transmission and put a flywheel in it. When we pulled the transmission, put a flywheel in it, quiet as a mouse. I don't know how much longer they drove that thing. They may still be driving it, but they used that thing for a long time. But we worked and worked and worked and worked on this doggone thing to try to get that straightened out. And it was just one of those things that, you know, you just wonder if you're ever going to see the end of this thing. Right now, I will tell you this. These people were as patient and as nice and as easy to get along with as anybody I've ever worked with. They didn't complain about any of the prices. They didn't complain about how long it took. They complained about nothing. And these are people that, you know, they're customers you want to go out of your way to try to please. Have you ever noticed, the ones of you that are shop owners, that you spend most of your time trying to satisfy the people that off of whom you make the least money? In other words, the people that complain about their bill and don't want to pay and all this kind of stuff, they're the ones that you spend the most time trying to satisfy them. Well, one day I was at my dad's, he had a sawmill that he ran. We sawed out some lumber to build me a house and all that stuff he put in. But anyway, he also still had his Volkswagen shop. And this guy pulled up out there one day, and he had this Volkswagen Bug that was not running right. I mean, he barely, you know, it sounded like it was hitting on about 2 cylinders. Almost sounded like maybe 1, but it was horrible, you know, just barely running. And so somebody picked the guy up and he left the vehicle out there. And I watched my dad, and he worked on it, and he found a big vacuum leak. You might remember the dual port heads on the 72 and newer Bugs, you know, how they had a rubber boot there, and when that boot had a tendency to split on the backside, it would pull vacuum in there and it caused it to misfire on some cylinders. Anyway, he adjusted the valves, he put points and plugs in it, and he fixed the vacuum leak and all that. Put it back together, and I watched it. He cranked it up, and it was just running just as smooth as silk. And so the bill, my dad never really charged as much as he should have when he did work like that. I mean, you know, he would, you know, I don't remember exactly how much the bill was, but it wasn't nearly what I thought it should have been, but it was extremely fair. All right, and this slippery son of a gun come back, and he says, well, before I pay you, can I drive it down the road? And so him and my dad got in it, and we took it down the road. And whenever they came back, that guy says, well, when we stopped to turn around up there and come back, I thought I might have heard it backfire one time. And so he wanted less to not pay the whole bill or something. He just didn't want to have to pay for the whole repair because he was trying to come up with something he could cook up about how it wasn't working right. And so my dad says, just go ahead and take it and don't worry about it. And I never, you know, it took me a long time to get over that, you know, because I knew that car was running like trash when it came in here. And I knew, and I don't think the bill was even $50. It wasn't very much that he was charging him. And he worked on it like 2 hours and all that. Anyway, Johnny was my main man on this when he'd survived Iraq. And he survived this nasty Alero too. He was a really good student, Johnny was. He went to work at a Ford dealer somewhere after we got through here. All right, so he told me a few months later he had heard that at least 3 of these 2.4, not 24, 2.4, I hit a 0 instead of 1, making the same noise in the same way. They didn't come in to have that noise repaired, and knowing something about the trouble we went to this one, he wasn't going to try and upsell a fix either. All right, a 4-cycle, 6-cylinder engine has a firing event every how many degrees of crankshaft rotation? That's question number 1. I'm going to back up and give you these answers after we go through all the questions. 0.25, so 25 hundredths of a millimeter is equal to how much of an inch? Look at those 4 answers and think about them. Question 3, retarded cam timing will do what to engine vacuum? It should be fairly easy if you've measured vacuum and done a lot of work. Question 4, the purpose of EGR is to do what? Question 5, the purpose of valve overlap is what? A, to make sure the valve doesn't leak after machining. B, allow the incoming intake flow to purge remaining exhaust gas. C, increase volumetric efficiency. Or D, prevent the valves from contacting the piston on the exhaust stroke. Question 6, Technician A says an engine knock always means something in the engine is loose. Technician B says a cylinder can have good compression rings and still consume engine oil. Who is correct? When exhaust emissions from a healthy engine are measured, this is question 7, blank should read high and all the other gases should read low. Question 8, the reason a diesel engine fires on compression is for every pound of compression, the air charge is heated by how many degrees? Question 9. Technician A says torque to yield bolts stretch when they're torqued properly. Technician B says torque to yield bolts should never be reused. Who is correct? And question 10. Technician A says an engine with a cranking compression of 140 psi on every cylinder should have a running compression of at least 200 psi on every cylinder. Technician B says a stuck shut IAC valve can indirectly cause a low compression concern. All right, let's back up. 4-cycle, 6-cylinder engine has a firing event every 120. You take 720, which is how many times the crankshaft turns during a 4-stroke cycle, and divide that by the number of cylinders you have, you get the right answer to this question. It's 120. 25 hundredths of a millimeter is equal to 40 thousandths of an inch. Now, if you're a stickler and you're a math head and you know that it's, extend all those decimals out and make it exactly right, close enough, 40 thousandths of an inch. One of the things that I thought was funny was I had some students that were dual enrollment students, and these dual enrollment students, I asked them that. I said, if 40 thousandths of an inch equals 25 hundredths of a millimeter, how many thousandths of an inch is 25 hundredths of a millimeter? Now, if you think about that, if you take 40 thousandths and divide it into 4, that's 25 hundredths of a millimeter. Well, they absolutely could not figure that out. And then one of the maintenance men came walking through there. It was real sharp. And I said, hey, I hadn't even talked to him about this. And when I asked him a question, he came up with 10 thousandths off the top of his head. But the right answer to this is 40 thousandths. Retarded cam timing is going to decrease engine vacuum. Now, if the camshaft is running behind the crankshaft, right? In other words, the crankshaft running ahead of the camshaft, engine vacuum is going to be low. Engine vacuum will also be low if you've got a cammed up, an aggressive cam grind. Like if you cammed one up and you build an engine with one of those, you're going to have low vacuum at idle. And if you're using a map sensor, it'll make it run rich at idle, but it'll run okay at other speeds. All right, the purpose of EGR is to reduce NOx emissions. You're basically recirculating exhaust gas. The purpose of valve overlap is to allow the incoming intake flow to purge the remaining exhaust gas. This happens when the piston is right at the very top of its exhaust stroke anyway. Okay? So there's not a lot of gas movement that has to happen before that purges out of there. Technician A says an engine knock always means something in the engine is loose. That's false. Technician B says a cylinder can have good compression rings and still consume engine oil. Those oil rings, and most everybody knows this if you've built any engines or if you've done engine work, is like a squeegee that's supposed to keep the cylinder walls pretty well wiped down so that there's not oil left in the combustion chamber. You can have really good compression rings and good compression, but you can have clogged up oil rings that are stuck, that aren't squeegeeing the oil off the cylinder walls right, and it can burn oil because of oil rings, even if the compression rings are still okay. All right. When exhaust emissions from a healthy engine are measured, CO2 should read high and all the other gases should read low. All right, so there's your CO2 right there. When your engine's breathing out the same thing that we're breathing out, and whenever it's causing the grass beside the road to grow so much they got to mow it all the time, we're basically going green if the CO2 that we're putting out is causing the grass and the trees to do better. The reason a diesel engine fires on compression is for every pound of compression the charge is heated 2 degrees. This is a sort of an average figure, but the point is if you got 450 pounds of compression, that air is going to be 900 degrees. Unless the cylinder walls and the piston are really, really, really cold because they've been sitting all night on a really cold day, that's when you need your glow plugs to warm things up a little bit so that compression can happen. I've told that one story at one time about this Power Stroke that came in with, it was a 7.3, it's got that fuel pump down in the valley, and it came in and they said it would start kind of hard. And I says, okay, so I looked at it, and it's supposed to have from 55 to 80 pounds of fuel pressure, as I remember, and it only had like 20 pounds, and I said, this thing ain't got enough fuel pressure. And so they went over there, the line mechanic over there, they said, well, you got too much drivability work to do. So Eddie put the fuel pump on it. He just popped the fuel pump on it right quick, so the line mechanic over there. And they started trying to fire that thing up with that new fuel pump on there. And that darn thing would spin and spin and spin and puff out white smoke and spin and spin and spin and puff out white smoke. It would start, whenever they pulled it in there. And the shop foreman came to me, the same slim pickings talking guy I'm talking about. I really like that guy. But he came over there and he was kind of hard-headed about stuff. And he says, why do you suppose this diesel won't start? I said, I think it's probably flooded. He goes, no, you can't flood no diesel. I don't know what you're talking about. So he goes back over and so he spun it a while longer. I was like, they're going to burn the starter up. They keep that up. You know how that sounds. And so finally, he says, can you come over here and look at this thing? And I went in there and I pulled up the NGS2 and I looked at the control oil pressure, you know, the injector control pressure. And when I spun it for just a second, it went up to 3,600 pounds. I said, it ain't supposed to be that high when you're just starting it, you know. And so I says, Eddie, I says, you know, what had happened was that low pressure, it had caused it to, kind of like long fuel trim, it had worked that pressure way up and way up and way up to get it to start when it was hard to start because the fuel pressure was low, and that's what it took to do it. Well, with the right amount of fuel pressure, it put too much fuel in there because it still had those numbers stored in its memory. So I told Eddie, I said, pull both battery cables off this thing for about 5 minutes and let's talk about this. And so he says, tell me again how you can flood a diesel. Because if you put enough fuel in there, then you're going to basically be absorbing all of the compression heat with all that fuel, and it's just not going to fire. You cannot put that much fuel in a diesel and expect it to fire when you first start it up. No, he's shaking his head. So I said, put the battery cable back on. Put the battery cable back on, you know, and it fired up without it. You just breathe on the key and that thing was running. And even after it started, he was still saying, no. I still laugh about that today. But anyway, a technician A says, torque to yield bolts stretch when they are torqued properly, and they do. Technician B says, torque to yield bolts should never be reused. Who's correct about that? All right, both of those guys are correct because you should never reuse torque to yield bolts. The first time I ever ran into torque to yield bolts on anything was in 1984 when I was working at the Lincoln dealer, and they gave me a cylinder head job to do on a Mercury. What was it? There was the Ford Escort, and then there was the Mercury. It wasn't a Tracer then. It was something, maybe it was. Anyway, whatever the Mercury version of it was, Lynx. That's what it was. It was a Lynx. What I had a tendency to do, I flipped through the book over and I found a torque spec that said 44 foot-pounds. I said, well, that's not very much for head bolts, but here we go. So I went in and put that thing back together and run it out of the shop. And then later I found out you're supposed to go another 90 degrees twice after 44 foot-pounds. That's what happens when you don't read the book close enough, right? Anyway, I never came back with a blown gasket, so I don't know what the deal was on that. Anyway, technician A says an engine with a cranking compression of 140 psi on every cylinder. The running compression is going to be a lot lower than the cranking compression, and you're going to have higher running compression on overhead valve, on the overhead cam engines, these are 4 valves per cylinder, than you are on overhead valve engines at the camshafts in the block. That's just, facts of life. Generally, the compression will be higher all the way around on the overhead cam engine, usually. Technician B says a stuck IEC valve can indirectly cause a low compression concern. The way this happens is when you've got a something like and I've mentioned this before, these car lots will drive their cars around, move them around, shuffle them around so it don't look like they got the same car sitting there all day, every day. They crank them up, they move them over here, they shut them off. They crank them up, they move them somewhere else, they shut them off. They don't let them warm up. And they're always on cold enrichment. And what happens then is they wet the plugs. When they wet the plugs, then they won't start, and they keep spinning them over, and the injectors are just squirting fuel in there, squirting fuel in there, squirting fuel in there, and it washes the cylinder walls down. And with these low-tension piston rings on these newer engines, when you wash the cylinder walls down, it doesn't turn slow and sluggish like it used to on our old 302 and 350. It actually spins like it's got no compression at all, and it'll fool you into thinking you got a jump timing belt. I used to see that on Ford Contours and stuff a lot. But if the idle air control sticks shut, and it doesn't get any air, but it's squirting a lot of fuel in there, it can cause it to develop this same low compression concern because it's squirting all that fuel in there. There's no air going in there, and it can. But if you crack the throttle a little, which most people don't know to do anymore, since we don't have carburetors on most cars, you can bypass that. A lot of people don't even touch the gas; so let's spin it until they wash the cylinder walls down. Anyway, that pretty well completes my presentation for today. And I really hope you enjoy this. This is a little different than ones I usually do, and I managed to squeeze a couple of stories in here. But I do appreciate you guys watching, and I appreciate your support, and I appreciate your comments. And I know some of you guys have got really good stories too. But I will see you next time.